Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Hello and welcome to another case-cracking episode of Cinelit. For today, the game is afoot as we are looking at the clues in the mystery case of the Sherlock Holmes film series, starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. John H. Watson. My name is Adam Marsh and I'm your host today, and today I'm joined by Cinelit's resident expert, Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Adam. I've got the old deerstalker and cape on today, or maybe I'm Watson to your Holmes. I don't know.
You look resplendent. So basically, when we started doing this podcast nearly 2 years ago now, one of the areas we wanted to look at was crime cinema, or one of the areas I wanted to look at was crime cinema. And we started with the best will in the world to do a series within Cinelit of crime cinema, and then it's kind of gone out of the window. We did one on early silent cinema crime and early gangster movies. And then we've kind of just not really done much since. But we did one on French Connection movies, so we've dipped our toe in occasionally. But we thought we would resurrect that strand here today by doing an episode on the 1939 Sherlock Holmes film series.
Yeah, and how better to do this, really, because, of course, in that silent session that we did, one of the films we covered was Sherlock Holmes Baffled from 1900. The first Holmes movie on record, apparently, 30 seconds long, and we managed to talk about it for about 5 minutes.
So, we spoke way longer.
So, if we do that sort of ratio today, we'll be talking about hour-long movies for 5 hours, but I don't think we're going to get there. But, Holmes is an interesting character in terms of cinema, because, of course, he's from the great literary background, Conan Doyle's famous stories around the late Victorian era and early part of the 20th century. But apparently it's said that Holmes is supposedly the most portrayed human character on screen. I think Dracula and maybe Jesus and other people have been portrayed just as much, but Holmes is often cited as being, however you define a human character, he's rather than a sort of fantasy figure like a Dracula or any sort of supernatural creature or whatever,
or a living embodiment of a deity.
Yeah. They're saying that Holmes is the most portrayed, and I think he's been played by something like 70 or 80 different actors, if not more. Hound of the Baskervilles was adapted in Germany quite a lot through the teens, 20s and 30s of the 20th century.
It was a big book, wasn't it, in Germany?
Yeah.
They had those whole series of pulp crime books, and the Conan Doyle ones have republished quite a lot in Germany.
Yeah, and Baskerville has remained very popular over there, and of course it seems to be the go-to text for anyone filming Holmes, really. But popular in Britain as well. In the early 20s, an actor called Ailey Norwood played Holmes in over 40 films in just a 3-year period. Talk about cranking them out. Most of them were shorts, a couple of features. Then actors like Arthur Wantner, Peter Cushing, Jeremy Brett, Vasily Livanov in Russia, Robert Downey Jr., Benedict Cumberbatch have become identified with the role and have played, all of those actors have played the character multiple times. And there have been a lot of interesting one-offs as well. Quite often with the one-offs, you get people not necessarily playing Holmes, but sometimes playing a sort of variation on him, or an insane character who thinks they're Holmes or something like that. We've got to mention Sherlock Hound, early Hayao Miyazaki work there.
I think that's one of my early introductions to Sherlock Holmes. I think my dad bought me the Sherlock Hound video when I was a kid, and he bought me the collection of the 4 novels as well. So I think that was my entry point to Sherlock Holmes, as I'm sure many Japanese children have the same experience.
What a way to start, you know. And I'm perhaps unusual in this. I love the Holmes comedies as well. I really, really enjoyed Holmes and Watson a couple of years ago, which a lot of people didn't. I saw it on Boxing Day on release, and I think had I seen it on any other day of the year, I'd have probably hated it like everyone else. But seeing it on Boxing Day when it came out, it's a great Boxing Day film. You know?
They do keep going having a stab at the Holmes comedies, don't they, over the years? I mean, obviously the one that I remember from my childhood was Without a Clue with Ben Kingsley and Michael Caine.
Which is one of those examples of a sort of fake Holmes, isn't it? Yeah. And the one I love from about 10 years before that is Paul Morrissey's with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and most of the great sort of British comedy establishment of the sort of 50s and 60s. Again, a much hated film, but I love it so much that I've even got the poster, you know. But as they say in the movies, and as they say in Highlander, there can be only one, I think. And I'm certainly saying that it's Basil Rathbone. What's your feeling about Rathbone as Holmes?
Well, he certainly defined Holmes, didn't he? He was the first one that where you would go, okay, this is the definitive Holmes.
In terms of everyone who's come along since has sort of had a little bit of Rathbone in there before.
Well, I think so. Whether they're conscious or subconsciously, I think that's became, Holmes is that kind of character that, as portrayed by Basil Rathbone. Maybe Robert Downey Jr. strayed furthest away from that, I guess, in the more serious adaptations. But Basil Rathbone, Derbyshire educated by Basil Rathbone, I should say, Repton School.
Repton School, just down the road from where I grew up in Willington.
Oh, there you go.
So we're as a kid, I wasn't a big fan of Repton. They were like the enemy village. But the school's got its reputation, and Rathbone,
Rathbone was there. He's got a blue plaque in Repton, so he must be bona fide. But as I say, he's the definitive Holmes scholar. David Stewart Davis, one of the preeminent Holmesian. I think he's Holmesian. He's British, isn't he?
Yeah.
So I think in Britain they call them Holmesian scholars. In America they call them Sherlockians.
Yeah. Which
feels apt, I think. I don't know why. It just feels like a British scholar would be called Holmesian.
More reserved.
Yeah. So he described the casting as the closest to creating the definitive Sherlock Holmes on screen. And I think he's right. I think that's not the problem. I think the problem comes when you start talking about the elephant in the room here, don't you? You start talking about Nigel Bruce's Watson. I think that's where people fall down on these films.
Again, I think you can probably tell from what we've just said about other Holmes films that I love the Holmes comedies, and so my love of those sort of, I think, stems from loving Nigel Bruce in these films.
So you're a Nigel Bruce
I rewatched all the films just before Christmas, before I even knew we were doing this podcast. So
I totally hijacked your Christmas viewing to do this.
Why not? But I had set December aside to dig into the box set of the Holmes films, which has got David Stewart Davis all over it. He's written notes and done a couple of great commentaries on there. Really good Holmes scholar. And I watched the films this time with an eye on Nigel Bruce in particular, because I thought he always gets a sort of bum rap, and I'm going to really watch these films focusing on his character rather than Holmes or Moriarty or Mrs. Hudson or anyone else. And it was fascinating to do that because, you do get a sort of bumbling buffoon, throughout the series. But every now and then he gets to do stuff, and he does stuff and does it right, and helps out with the case. And there's even one film where he is instrumental in solving the case, House of Fear, 1945, where Holmes rather takes a bit of a backseat on that one. We'll come on to discuss that in more depth, but I can see why people don't like Nigel Bruce, and he certainly isn't the character that Conan Doyle wrote. But
no, I mean, it's one of those things.
What a great movie character, and what a great Nigel Bruce character.
Well, that's, I mean, it's funny you should say like that. I mean, I went in with a similar thing, not knowing that you were doing the same thing, but I went in there thinking, he can't be as bad as all that. Sure, I mean, in my head, he is that bumbling idiot, and what have you done to Watson kind of mentality. And yes, you're right. He is its own creation, his own Watson in some ways, but it's not nearly as bad as I remembered.
No,
I think you blow it up in your memory of how bumbling and how stupid he is, and he's not. He's just occasionally slightly.
I think there's precedent around that time, because not only in Bruce's own career, because he was sort of known for this sort of shtick, but also you've got the Charteris and Caldecott characters.
That's right, yeah.
From Hitchcock's Lady Vanishes, who were put in as a very similar sort of partly comedy relief, one foot in the comedy relief and one in the unfolding drama, and that's the position that I think Nigel Bruce as Watson takes in these films. I'd also say we did a podcast on Hammer's Dracula movies a while ago with Kevin Lyons, and we were saying then how Thorley Walters could do this, and you see Thorley in Dracula Prince of Darkness riffing on his own bumbling persona, very much like a Nigel Bruce type actor, who had that sort of career where he'd play these sort of bumbling figures, slightly upper class, often very sort of eccentric and stumbling his way through the film. And Thorley Walters uses that in Dracula Prince of Darkness as a means of having his character fool the authorities. He's like a lunatic in an asylum, but he sort of gets his own way and manages to get one over on them by using this sort of buffoonery. And there are elements of that in a good way, in a sort of positive way, in Nigel Bruce's character, I think. Sometimes he does that on his own. Sometimes Rathbone's Holmes sort of plays on it and sends him out somewhere, knowing that this whole routine that he goes through is going to distract people's attention while Holmes gets on with the business of investigating the case. So it's really cleverly used across the whole series, I think. And then as a Watson and Nigel Bruce fan, I really do love House of Fear, where it's his movie. It's very much his film.
I think the interesting thing about Watson, regardless of your take on Watson, of Nigel Bruce's take on Watson, prior to this, Watson really hadn't figured in the on-screen adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. It was very much like, well, Sherlock Holmes is a solo character. Yeah. And by the end of this series, I think it would be unthinkable to do a Holmes adaptation without Watson.
Yeah, again, this established that because even Doyle, the idea of the stories and the novels is that Watson's sort of working pretty much as a companion and secretary to Holmes, and he's sort of along for the ride, and he's on the cases. He's basically there to write them all down and keep a journal of what's happening. So he is, in that sense, he's sort of a background figure. Even in the original text, and he's relating and capturing the story of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, And this series, and 20th Century Fox, of course, kicked it off with their two films in the late 30s. So I think they can take the credit for doing this, for saying, we need this team. But of course, I suppose what you've got here is we were in a situation in the period of the early talkies where there'd been a big hit in the Thin Man movie, the Nick and Nora Charles film, and that had its own spin-offs and was developing into a series by the late 30s. And I suppose the concept that you have sort of twin detectives or a double act working on these cases was a good dramatic one for cinema, because your main guy had someone to sort of talk to as an audience representative.
Well, that was happening a lot in those serialized films. Your Charlie Chans, your Mr. Motos and things like that. You always had a companion, Charlie Chan, number one son, number two son, number five son, whatever. Then you had like Torchy Blaine, you had Torchy Blaine in that series, and you had the male detective as the spin-off there. So you always had that dynamic in those formats. Whether that was a case of like expediency, we've got an hour to tell the story. We need to be firing on all cylinders here and getting the information across, because these were hour-long movies. They weren't like full features. I think in some ways that developed that style, and then obviously that when Sherlock Holmes went from 20th Century Fox to Universal, and Universal kind of repositioned it as one of these B-movie series. Yeah. It was perfectly positioned to capitalise on that and crank them out over a 3 or 4 year period.
Yeah, because we've divided up the Universal films into 3 separate groups, and then we're going to sort of talk about the Fox ones initially as well as a fourth, And those Fox ones, they run sort of 80 minutes or so. They're very lavish. They're designed as A features. Yeah. So they're very different to the Universal ones in that sense. And I think it's not really documented anywhere that I've read why Fox decided to quit after 2 movies. I wonder if maybe they bit off slightly more than they could chew, and thought, well, they then saw all of these the sort of B movie series sort of coming along around the same time, and thinking, well, we can't really sustain this on these budgets, so we've got a choice here. We either reduce them to the level of a Charlie Chan or something, and crank them out and make them 65 minutes and spend less money on them, or we stop them altogether, and they seem to have elected to stop. So they did.
I did read somewhere that there was some sort of negotiation with the Doyle estate, trying to clear the rights to do more.
Right.
Was one of the reasons that they stated was why they didn't want to. They didn't end up not continuing with them. However, as you say, it could have been backed up by budgetary concerns.
Even that would have involved money at some stage of the discussion. So that's most likely where it all fell
Universal took it over, and they paid, I think it was like $300,000 for the rights for 7 years.
Yeah.
And the rights to 20.
That was to all. A number of the stories.
21 stories, but as part of the contract, they had to do 3 a year. 3 films a year, and 2 of them had to be direct adaptations. However loose that was.
Well, what's interesting with the adaptations is they always say they're doing it in the credits, and then they put a couple of lines in from a story, or they put one idea in from like the 5 Orange Pips or something, and then it's away with we'll just do what we want to do now. But I think to kick off briefly with the 2 Fox films, as we've said, they're more lavish than the Universal ones. Rathbone and Bruce seemed to be shifting from studio to studio at the time. I'm not sure if either of them were sort of contracted to a studio. They seemed to be able to jump from place to place, and were both getting lots and lots of work around this time. Rathbone, in fact, was working quite a lot at Universal. He was a sort of mainstay of their sort of late 30s and early 40s horror material. He played Frankenstein in Son of Frankenstein in that same year, 39. The Fox films, the first one, they decided to kick off with Hound of the Baskervilles, because why wouldn't you?
Yeah. But in some ways, it is an unusual. Sometimes, in some ways, it is unusual to start off with that film, because Holmes is like as we've discussed on other podcasts, it's that format of having your lead character out of the film for many years. Exactly. He just goes away.
I think people, or certainly film producers who aren't always the cleverest guys, often when they think, let's make a Holmes movie, the one they've heard of is Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's the one they think they can exploit as well. Like, it's got this monster dog in it, great, And then they hit these 2 problems. They suddenly look at the material and think, well, A, Holmes isn't really in it all that much, and B, how are we going to make the dog scary, And I think, to Fox's credit here, they get around both of those problems arguably better than anybody else ever has done.
I think definitely with the bringing Holmes back into it, because he's barely off screen in this version of the film.
And what they do with the Holmes character sets a tradition which was continued gleefully throughout the Universal series.
Yeah.
Not only Holmes in disguise, but as the Universal films progressed, everyone in disguise.
Yeah.
You know, even to the point where in one of the later Universal films, Watson finally catches on to the fact that Holmes sometimes dresses up as somebody else. And this entomologist comes in. It's in the Spider-Woman, 1944. This eminent entomologist comes into 221B Baker Street. And Watson sort of looks at us, you know, sort of breaks the fourth wall almost, and we all know it's Sherlock Holmes in disguise. And he starts tugging at this guy's beard and sort of joking with him and joshing with him. And of course, the gag is that Holmes then walks in the background, you know, and it is a guy in a crazy beard and crazy wig that looks like it's fake, you know. But yeah, the series really did play on that whole disguise thing, and it's Hound of the Baskervilles from Fox that kicks all that off.
And the disguise in that is pretty impressive as well. It's not like a lot of these things you watch. I mean, particularly in some of the latest Universal ones, you know you can tell it's Basil Rathbone straight away. You know, it's not wrong. But in this one, you had to there was a good couple of double takes. I'm thinking, is that him? And it was really good makeup. I remember not acknowledging that as I was watching.
And Rathbone doing this sort of ludicrous, I don't know, is it Cornish or something accent, playing this great wild sort of hermit living in this cave, and he's playing a zither and talking about. He talks about it's a zither or something, you know, and.
He's great.
Really, really good. You know, manages to disguise his voice in a way that you think, oh yeah, it is this over the top character. But is it or isn't it Basil Rathbone, you know, under all that?
Yeah.
Because, again, the series and other series like it would often have these sort of larger-than-life background characters anyway. Think of, again, in 1939, Bela Lugosi's Igor in Son of Frankenstein, who steals the show from Boris Karloff and Basil Rathbone, you know, which is some going. So audiences were used to these figures being in these sort of films. And so if you see one in Hound of the Baskervilles, the tendency would be to just think, oh, yeah, it's one of those great eccentric sort of supporting characters that we love, you know. And then when it turns out to be Sherlock in disguise, you know, it is quite a surprise, you know, or can be if you're not in the know.
Yeah. I think. I mean, the two that they did, they based the first one obviously on Hound of the Baskervilles, and then they went to the stage adaptation that was massively popular.
Yeah,
late Victorian
right.
period, early 20th century, the William Gillette play.
Yeah,
which for many years was the preeminent visual version of Holmes. Wasn't it?
I think that was first staged in 1899 and then ran through the early part of the 20th century. And Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is a bit of a weird title for part two of a projected franchise. You'd sort of think, shouldn't they have started with that and then gone to Hound of the Baskervilles next? But they called it Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it is supposedly based on the play, although they sort of throw that out of the window pretty early on.
Yeah.
But I really like that film. The idea of the killer with the sort of South American bolus is great. And when you see that in action, it knocks the head off a statue. You know, is brilliant. You know, okay, we're in 1939. We can't really show decapitation on film, although there had been other movies like The Man Who Reclaimed His Head that dealt with decapitation as a sort of central theme, you know. And here they managed to get it on screen by having a statue decapitated, and it's a great scene. I think it's a really strong film, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It tends to get overlooked, I think.
Yeah, well, for obvious reasons, it was like the one that they decided not to do any more on. Effectively, if you look at it in monetary terms. But yeah, as you say, I think it was like what if Fox continued on with an A-level budget for these series?
Yeah, I think we would have got more. Well, I call them adaptations, as we've said. They were sort of taking. I think they'd have used a lot more of the titles of the Conan Doyle stories.
Yeah.
And they'd have kept them fairly lavish. I think they'd have reduced the budgets, but maybe not to the level that Universal were. They'd have retained Rathbone and Bruce, I'm sure. I think they may well have used Moriarty as a regular villain. Because Moriarty is interesting throughout this series. He sort of dips in and out every now and then. he's always killed off by falling off a cliff edge or a high building. And then he comes back played by a different actor. You get Lionel Atwill, George Zucco, and Henry Daniell playing Moriarty, almost as if he's a different character. We've seen him die. It's a bit like the villain version of James Bond, I guess. Where when you see him fall off a cliff or off a high building or off a ledge or something, he's really dead. But then the idea of Moriarty is sort of adopted by the next criminal mastermind, and he comes along and. Maybe you can read the films like that. I don't know.
Well, you do see that sort of like the influences of pop culture on these things. It's often known as a comic book trope that no one's ever dead in comic books. They always come back, and it's like, well, but that's come from things like this.
Yes.
From those types of films, those serials feeding into comic books at their creation, and then now comic books are feeding back into cinema with characters never dying in movies.
Oh yeah, because by the mid-30s, we've already got some of the sort of established comic book characters that are still popular today.
Yeah.
And those ideas are you can see that filtering back, especially into these sort of B-movie series.
Absolutely.
And I mean, of course, the one we've not mentioned is the Dick Tracy series, which directly relates to that style of comic book character, and was the first series to really bring that to the screen in a sort of concerted way. While we're on Moriarty, one thing that you do get in the Universal series as it progresses is you also, when they're not using Moriarty, they often have a sort of faux Moriarty. You've got the Giles Conover character played by Miles Mander, who's fantastic. You've got the Spider-Woman, the brilliant Gail Sondergaard, who I think is the best villain of the entire 14 films.
Yeah.
And she even got her own spin-off sequel, The Spider-Woman Strikes Back. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Where again, she doesn't play the same character. So they even carry that on, they did a Spider-Woman sequel, but she's playing a different person in it, but with the same sort of motivation.
Right.
But yeah, what a great film Spider-Woman is. And she comes along and steals that from Rathbone and Bruce in a way that none of the Moriartys ever quite did.
No, well, the Moriartys in some ways are reproductions of Holmes. What if Holmes was evil? Kind of that's the kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
Whereas I think when you bring in the female protagonist, it's a different dynamic, and I think that's more opportunity to stand out and steal the picture from him.
Another thing you get with the villains in the Holmes series, and this happens a lot in the Universal ones, is you get a Moriarty or a Moriarty type figure. You get your supervillain, but often Holmes and Watson are pitted against a team of 3 people. And in one of the films, it's 4. I think in The Woman in Green, there is actually Moriarty in there.
Yeah.
And then you've got Moriarty. You normally get Moriarty or a supervillain type character. You get a femme fatale, and again in Spider-Woman they're sort of combined into the same body. So you get Moriarty or some kind of supervillain. You get a femme fatale. You get a sort of brutish henchman or a sort of Weasley creepy killer who does all the sort of spade work. And then in Woman in Green, you also get a creepy housekeeper as well, who's in on it all. So you've got this gang of 4. But yeah, often they use a sort of trio of villains, your supervillain, your femme fatale, and your guy who does all the murders, as a team working against Holmes and Watson. And that's sustained throughout quite a few of the... That's in sort of around about half of the films.
Yeah.
So it became a thing,
Yeah. Maybe it was just they definitely had a rep company feel to it as well. So it was like maybe sometimes it was just like, well, let's bring back Thingy, or he can be in this one.
Yeah, because when you look through the cast list, I mean, you get Lionel Atwill playing Moriarty, but then actors like him are appearing throughout the franchise in other parts as well. Hilary Brooke appears in a couple. She plays the villainess in one, but she's playing a supporting character in another. And quite often you'll get very familiar character players, people like Halliwell Hobbs, who pop up in different roles in the series. So yeah, look through the credits of these films, and you'll find a lot of the same actors in them, but never playing the same part.
No. So we get going back to the end. We get the end of the Fox movies, and there's a 3-year gap where we have the gap between Fox letting the rights expire and Universal picking up. However, that wasn't the end of Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce and Basil Rathbone.
Well, what happens in between, of course, is the Second World War breaks out.
Yeah.
And then, in 1941, America gets involved in the war.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking before that, actually, it was like they continued their duo on radio for over 200 episodes between 1939 and 1946. So,
very popular.
In American homes, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce were constantly being reinforced as Holmes and Watson.
Yeah. And, of course, radio in those days was pretty much like TV is now. It was just the thing everyone experienced in their home. When you wanted entertainment at home, you put on the wireless. You know?
So, I mean, I guess when Universal were crunching the figures, having a nationally recognised duo as Holmes and Watson made it fairly easy.
Like, well, why don't Fox want to carry on doing this?
Yeah.
We'll nab it, and good on them. And as we've said, in the meantime, war breaks out. America gets involved in the war, and that identifies the first three Universal movies. We've got Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, and Sherlock Holmes in Washington. We should mention as well at this point that John Rawlins, who was a sort of jobbing Universal director and ended up working in westerns in the 50s, handled the first movie, but all of the remainder of the series, the next 11 films, were all directed by the same guy, Roy William Neill.
Yeah.
And he, like Basil Rathbone and like a lot of the other people we've mentioned, Lionel Atwill and George Zucco, he was heavily involved in Universal's B-movie horror unit as well. So he was not only churning out the Holmes films 3 a year, but he was doing a lot of other films as well, at a similar sort of level.
He died of a heart attack in 1946 at the end of the series. Maybe that's not disconnected there from
his doctor was probably, on set, sort of looking at the veins throbbing in his forehead, and often working with a lot of the same actors as well across the Holmes films and in all the other stuff he was doing. But he only lasted 5 months, I think, after the last film, Dressed to Kill.
Yeah,
and then unfortunately it was curtains.
Yeah.
So, what a run of films. Even if he just made those 11 Holmes films, that'd be a legacy. All the other stuff he did as well is fantastic.
So we get to the war years, and yes, they do the monumental decision to update it to the 1940s, to contemporary period.
Although, of course, having said that, Holmes was always contemporary.
Well, that's what their argument was. Well, Holmes is contemporary. Holmes is,
and still is with Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah.
So it's Holmes, and I think Holmes is a figure that you can do that with.
Yeah.
Every generation can have it.
I think that's one thing when people forget, when people look back and say, "Oh, they updated it and brought him so he was fighting the Nazis," as if it was a different time period.
Yeah,
it was well, it wasn't. It was the contemporary time period.
Yeah.
That was the world as it was.
And people watching those films now will look back and say, "Well, their period."
Yeah,
exactly. They're set in the 1940s.
Exactly. Yeah.
So. And that will happen with the Benedict Cumberbatch ones. In 50 years' time, people will say, "Oh, yeah,
they updated it to the 2000s."
Yeah, they're set in the 2010s. When all this primitive early computer technology was being used.
Yeah, remember the days when we didn't have downloading films straight into your brain? Oh, those days. Yeah.
But I think Holmes is a character that you can do this with, because part of the thing with Holmes is, he's always got to prove himself as being better than the police, and he's there to handle the cases that the police can't handle, and that's particularly good in a wartime setting where he's investigating spies and infiltrating Nazis and things like that, and trying to crack codes and find out where bombing raids are going to take place. And this is all out of the sort of purview of the police, really. It's not the sort of work that they do. It's more military intelligence. And Holmes is a good sort of hookup for that. He's a good person that can be brought in from the outside to get involved in sort of wartime espionage. And I think these first three Universal films are stronger than people often say. I agree.
I mean,
really good fit for the character.
I mean, me too. I think they they establish certain tropes of this Universal series that continues on. I mean, the closing monologue being one of the criticisms and also features of these films. People often either love or hate those closing Holmesian monologues as he ends. You know,
I mean, he often quotes Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
My favourite one is in Sherlock Holmes Faces Death, though, from 1943. My favourite writer on the series was the wonderfully named Bertram Milhauser. I think he wrote, if you see his name on the credits, you know you're in for a good time with Holmes. And he wrote this original piece for the end of Sherlock Holmes Faces Death. And I've got it written down here. I'll read some of it out. Now, apply this to 2021. This is written in 1943 by Bertram Milhauser and delivered brilliantly at the end of Faces Death by Basil Rathbone. And he says, "There's a new spirit abroad in the land. The old days of grab and greed are on their way out. We're beginning to think of what we owe the other fellow, not just what we're compelled to give him. The time is coming, Watson, when we shan't be able to fill our bellies in comfort while other folk go hungry, or sleep in warm beds while others shiver in the cold." That never goes out of date.
Well, depressingly current.
Yeah. But that's in 1943, and you're right in the middle of a wartime situation there. So it's entirely relevant to the contemporary audience.
And it wasn't as that. Some of the earlier ones are a bit hammy, a bit on the nose, kind of like this Green Island, this Scepter land. It's that, that kind of.
I think often when they're using literary quotes or they're quoting from Churchill, they've picked out the ones that. There's something that's jumped off the page at the writer, and when Rathbone comes to deliver it, it is a little bit it's very on the nose. But I think Milhauser shows with his little speech at the end there from Sherlock Holmes Faces Death that when he was writing his own stuff, he could hit it perfectly, and that's one for the ages, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, we get three different types of war stories with this one, don't we? We get the one of the 39 step style, the one that ends in the church. The Voice of Terror. Yeah,
with a sort of Lord Haw character. This idea of broadcasts from who knows where. Dishing out the Nazi propaganda, and Holmes has got to sort of track down who this is, and. Again, one of the sort of continuing things, something they used in more than one film across the Universal series, and even outside of the sort of wartime sort of circle, was that they'd have this, when the villain is revealed, it's someone who they've not only known from the start of the film, but is a mate. He's like a pal or someone who's an establishment figure that they respect, and... it's quite an interesting sort of trope to use across the series. They did do it in 3 or 4 of the films and kept coming back to it. But it's its first use here in this sort of traitorous figure, very much in the sort of Lord Haw style. So it would have had resonance with the audience at the time. Yeah. They would have known from the national news and the international news that there are people like this, there is a real voice of terror out there,
and also radio was the main way of as we've talked about, of getting across the mass populace,
and entertainment. Yeah.
And then we get The Secret Weapon in 1943.
Yeah.
And also Sherlock Holmes in Washington in 1943. So 2. One of them based on a Sherlock Holmes, The Adventures of Dancing Men, which is loosely adapted. I'm not a big fan of this one. The Secret Weapon one.
Yeah,
I don't think it works.
It's one of the lesser entries. The series is sort of finding its feet a little bit. This is only the second Universal one, and they already seem to be running out of ideas a little bit. And as you say, not quite sure how to shoehorn Conan Doyle into it. I think Bruce and Rathbone are good in it as Watson and Holmes. But it's a weak entry. When you look back at the 14 films in retrospect, it's not one of the ones you'd pick off the shelf, is it?
No, and also at that time it's like, well, it doesn't matter because in 6 months' time we've got another one. It wasn't even 6 months' time; it was like February to April.
Yeah,
we had in April we had the next one. We had the Sherlock Holmes in Washington, which is much more dynamic.
Oh yeah.
We've got plane journeys, we've got train journeys, we've got Washington. We've got secret compartments in antique shops. It's a real rollicking adventure, and it probably is no surprise that this was a completely original story. There was they didn't have to shoehorn any other Holmes stuff into this one.
Sure.
And again, set the tone for some of the later ones, I think.
I think so, because what you move into next is a 5-film group where this comes into sort of my territory, because as Quad's Mr. Horror, we suddenly get 5 films, again done in the space of about 15 months or something. Roy William Neill just cranking them out and doing other stuff in between. And we get these 5 films on a sort of macabre sort of tip. In fact, the middle 3, I would actually say, are horror films.
Yeah,
and the 2 outside are sort of old dark house movies, or we've got Sherlock Holmes Faces Death, which we've already mentioned, and The House of Fear, which we've already mentioned, as the bookends. And then in between, you get what are effectively Universal horror films of the 1940s. And they're among the 3 best Universal horror films. By this point, their Dracula and Frankenstein series are really on the skids, and the Mummy films are pretty terrible. I love all of those. I love going back to watch the Frankenstein and Mummy sequels and the Wolfman movies and so on. But they're not great.
They're running on empty at that point, aren't they?
These 3 Sherlock Holmes films are fantastic Universal horror films. We've got the Spider-Woman, which we've mentioned in passing, the Scarlet Claw and the Pearl of Death. And I think Scarlet Claw and Pearl of Death are arguably the best 2 films of the series.
I think Scarlet Claw's fantastic.
It's great.
It's a proper... it takes that sort of like the mystery of the murder and moves it more into slasher territory, where there's a series of murders and they're happening through this movie.
Well, what we've got here is 2 things. We've got the slasher element. Certainly, it is like a sort of 80s slasher movie. It really is. It's got that template to it. The great thing that Scarlet Claw does, and this continues in Pearl of Death as well, which has also got a sort of slasher-type sort of template, what those 2 films do is they bring in character development within the characters of Holmes and Watson. It's rather fascinating because Holmes is a character who is used to dealing with Moriarty types, master criminals, supervillains, but they're people on the same intellectual level as him, and they're people who leave puzzles for him, and they leave clues for him to work out. And suddenly, in both Scarlet Claw and in Pearl of Death, he's facing these waves of slasher murders, and he doesn't know what to do. And Universal write that into the scripts, and Rathbone is floundering, and not as an actor, but Holmes is floundering as a character, and Rathbone manages to play that brilliantly.
He did say around about this period, he said, for God's sake, would it kill us just to have him fail once? Because it's like
which
sick
of course is a Conan Doyle thing, because Conan Doyle wrote a couple of stories where Holmes doesn't solve the case and fails, even one famously where he dies, so it goes right along. It is faithful in that sense to Conan Doyle, in that Holmes doesn't always win, and here he's completely lost. It's like, this is a new type of case. Where are the clues? What do I do? And all he can do is watch as people are killed off one by one. And he genuinely does not know what to do. And Rathbone registers this brilliantly. And of course, the one of the series regulars we've not mentioned is Dennis Hoey as Inspector Lestrade. And Lestrade again is brought in to make Watson look less stupid. He's the guy who is there to make Watson look clever. But as Holmes is floundering, Lestrade comes into his own, because suddenly actual Scotland Yard police methods can take over, and he suddenly looks like he knows what he's doing, because these are cases that are more in his sort of domain, you know. And Watson gets involved more as well, mainly from a medical point of view, because people are being slashed or hacked to death, you know, and he's able to come in and instead of being the bumbling buffoon, he's there. He's describing what the wounds are and what's caused them. He's there as a professional, you know. And I think these films are great because of that, because you get genuine character development in these characters that have become ciphers by this point. We know what Sherlock Holmes is. We know what Nigel Bruce's version of Watson is. We know what Dennis Hoey's version of Inspector Lestrade is. And suddenly, in these two films, Scarlet Claw and Pearl of Death, that all shifts. Pearl of Death is brilliant because it's a pretty good adaptation of the Six Napoleons. And it's one of the, again, it takes huge liberties with it, but it's
the loose structure,
faithful as they get. I think.
The loose structure is still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just amps up the violence, I think, with the Napoleon owners, I guess.
Yeah. And again, what you've got is you've got your classic setup of the trio that we mentioned. You've got your supervillain, you've got your femme fatale, played by Evelyn Ankers in this one, I think, who again was a mainstay of the Universal horror films. She was the sort of go-to. Either lady in peril or occasionally she'd play a sort of villainess in the Universal horrors. And again, she's a perfect fit for the Holmes series. And then you've got your sort of henchman who does all the killings. And in Pearl of Death, of course, it's the great Rondo Hatton.
The creeper.
I really think we ought to do an entire podcast on Rondo sometime.
Yeah, I'd be up for that, definitely. I think it's interesting.
Rather than sort of go into his history now. But if you don't know him, look him up, read his life story, which is absolutely fascinating, and how he ended up playing monsters in cheap horror films in the mid-40s. But he plays the Hoxton Creeper in this one, brilliantly named. Or as Dennis Hoey describes him, the Oxton Horror. And again, you've got this idea that there's this stolen pearl that has been embedded into one of these 6 busts of Napoleon, and the villains are trying to find these busts which have been sold to different people. And the mystery is that the dead bodies of the victims are found among a mass of broken crockery.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's going on here? Why are the bodies in all this shattered?
It is a trope that both Conan Doyle and this series comes back to, the sort of like something hidden in a multiple, like in this case Napoleon's busts, but we have it in the Christmas turkeys in the Conan Doyle stories, and then we have it later on in Dress to Kill with the music boxes.
Yes, and the train set one as well, Terror by Night. That has a diamond hidden in a. Well, there's like a coffin with a false bottom, and there's a missing diamond, and there's various different places it may be. Yeah, so it is something that became a bit of a series regular. But as you say, it goes back to the source. But Pearl of Death has, as we said, had Rondo Hatton as the killer, and he's this great hulking brute of a man who sort of lumbers in and breaks people's backs in this film. Again, rather hideous sort of detail that,
Absolutely,
and quite strong for its time, and one that you could imagine sort of being brought forward 40 years into the slasher era. And again, Holmes doesn't know what to do. He's faced with something that he's never faced before, just brutal murder one by one. And all he can do is sort of really stand by and watch as these people die in front of his eyes.
Yeah.
And it's great. I think Rathbone plays this version of Holmes really, really well. He's so good at playing Holmes as a sort of forensic, honing in on the clues, getting the magnifying glass out and studying what's happening, very scientific.
Yeah.
Sort of criminal investigator, but he's equally good at playing a Holmes who is faced with something that he's never faced before and not quite knowing how to deal with it.
Well, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I think in other adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and other styles of these kind of heroes, they tend to try and get around this by making them amazing boxers that could disable a hulking man. So they create some reasons why this person can defeat somebody who's miles bigger than them and more powerful than them. And they do that in Superman, and they do it in all these different kind of things. They create those things. And where in this one, they don't even try. They say, no, he's out of his depth. He's a genius in this field, but here he's out of his depth, and he can't do anything.
The scene towards the end of Pearl of Death, where you get the inevitable confrontation between the Hoxton Creeper and Sherlock Holmes, is terrifying. You're really, really scared for Rathbone, because you think he's not going to get out of this. He's going to get his back snapped like everyone else.
And he does, and then the film series ends at that point. Obviously, it doesn't.
Well, on that score, that brings us into scenes of Holmes in deadly peril in the series, often at the hands of Moriarty. Again, one of the films has Holmes being hypnotised by Moriarty and walking along a high ledge, which, of course, Moriarty then falls off, as we've said, spoilers. But, it's not really a spoiler, because if you see Moriarty in any of the Universal Sherlock Holmes films, he falls off something. But he's luring Holmes into a supposed hypnotic trance and then trying to instruct him to walk off the end of this high building. There's a great scene in one of the Holmes Moriarty confrontations. I forget which film it is, but it's a reference to Holmes and his drug taking, which of course we get famously at the end of the very first film, the 20th Century Fox film Hound of the Baskervilles. The very famous line at the end of that movie, right at the fade out, where Holmes has solved the crime and he says, I'm going off for a rest now. I've done my bit. I'm going off to get some sleep. And he walks out of the room, and you think, right, the film's going to end with Sherlock going off to his well-earned sort of bit of shut-eye, And as he gets to the door, he turns back and shouts out, "Oh, Watson, the needle!" Out of nowhere, and I gather that few seconds of film has been snipped out of some prints over the years.
Right.
But there's one of the films where Holmes has been captured by Moriarty and he's strapped him to a medical, like a surgical trolley. And they have this great sort of intellectual conversation about what's the best way to die or the worst way to die, or how would you choose to die, And because Moriarty's saying, "Look, Holmes, I'm going to kill you, but how do you want to go?" And Rathbone replies by saying, "Well, I think one really agonising, slow way to kill someone would be to inject them with a hypodermic and then drain all of their blood out bit by bit." And Moriarty replies to that by saying, the needle to the end, Holmes?
Yeah.
So he obviously knows, there's a reference to tell us, the audience, Moriarty knows that Holmes has got a drug addiction. I think that's a brilliant callback to that. And
they don't dwell on that at all in these series. He's the hero. We don't get any sign of weakness generally.
No.
In these films. We move on from the horror movie types to, I guess, the last three, where, and particularly Pursuit to Algiers, which really stands out as a big direction change after those 4 or 5 horror-tinged, macabre-tinged, old dark house types.
I'd put that and Terror by Night together as a pair, really, because they're both set in they're both set on journeys and they're set in confined spaces. What these are again, to bring in the slasher comparison here, these are the Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan of the Sherlock Holmes series, especially Pursuit to Algiers. You see that title and you think, oh, wow, we're in for a globe-trotting adventure here, which is obviously going to end up in Algiers, and it's going to be Holmes chasing the villains across Europe and across Africa, to get to we're going to see all these exotic locations. And then it all takes place on board a boat.
Yeah, you're not getting that in part 12 of a film series at all, are you? But
the title suggests that you're going to, which is brilliant.
But all that said, I really enjoyed this one. For me, it was like a real adventure romp style film.
Yeah.
And it had witty exchanges. It had Watson doing what he does. It has Holmes doing the sort of like, oh, and this is really clever, and I'm going to reveal the real things here now, and being one step ahead of the bad guys at every point, which sometimes can be really annoying. But in this one, I felt like it was enjoyable seeing the lengths that he's gone to stay one step ahead of the criminals in this one.
We've mentioned a lot on the podcast that one of our favourite films here at Quad is Dario Argento's Deep Red, and we love the hidden in plain sight aspect of Deep Red. And in more than one of these Sherlock Holmes films, but I think best of all in Pursuit to Algiers, you get the hidden in plain sight reveal. You know, when we find out what's happening at the end of the film, and for once we won't spoil it on this one because you need to find out. But when you find out what's happening, and you think, oh, it's been in front of us all the time, you know, it's brilliant. It works so well. You mentioned how good Nigel Bruce is in this film.
He is good.
I think Bruce is particularly good in the films when he's in his element, when he's dealing with people of his own class and his own status, people he can sort of get along with. And on board a ship, he's absolutely in his element. You know, it's all about cocktails at dinner and associating with the upper crust and everything. And again, Bruce is able to play this. People often say he's a limited actor, but I think across this series, we've talked about Pearl of Death and Scarlet Claw, where you see him at work as a professional doctor, and he really comes into his element in a way that Holmes doesn't. And then in these later films, where they're on board ships and trains or they're associating with the upper class, you see this side of Watson come out. It happens as well in House of Fear and in Sherlock Holmes Faces Death as well, among the sort of macabre batch, where they're dealing with these sort of clubs, you know, these societies that have been formed by lords or upper class gentlemen. And Watson's part of this. This is his world, you know. This is where he lives and exists. When he's not associating with Holmes at 221B Baker Street, this is his world, you know. And we get glimpses of that in Faces Death and in House of Fear, but particularly in these final four films.
Like we said earlier on, this is one of those ones where he's been tasked by Holmes to be the lightning rod. He's there to draw attention. And just go ahead and be yourself.
That's because Holmes recognises that this is Watson's world and that he can be of some use here.
No, absolutely. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed this one. The sort of like the killings through the portholes. It was like, it had a lot that I thoroughly engaged with and really enjoyed.
And if Pursuit to Algiers and Terror by Night have been made primarily because the series is winding down at this point, they're running out of money. They've got to do these things on confined sets, you know, which we're on a journey, but the film's all taking place on sets, pretending to be ships or trains, you know. But this turns out to be almost by accident a really good fit again for these characters. You know,
well, I think
they're good in confined spaces and they're good on these journeys where we the audience never go anywhere.
But I think it's also one of those ones where we, like you say, we know the characters now. So when you are limited by budget, you are limited by sets and etc. You just fall back on that character, and those characters come out, and they're so effortlessly by this point that it's like a fun. You know, it's fun spending time with these guys now. We're 10, 12, 13 films in. We can just do that. It's just them doing stuff, and that's enough for us at this point.
Sure, they go beyond the budgetary restraints. You know, it doesn't matter how cheap these films are, because you've got the instant class there in the acting of Rathbone and Bruce and the supporting cast. You know, and that's always going to shine out. You know, that breaks the bonds of the limitations of the series, I think. It's disappointing, I think, that the run ends with Dressed to Kill. Now, if you're going to watch any film called Dressed to Kill, we highly recommend the Brian De Palma movie of that name. And if only De Palma had been around to direct this one, I think. It's good. None of the 14 films are bad, but it's not a great way to go out. It sort of goes through the motions.
It does have a nice moment where he gets outwitted.
Yes.
Which you don't really, I don't think we've had properly. No. He gets properly outwitted in this one by the female protagonist.
Yeah, who's in disguise at the time
exactly.
as well. Brilliantly.
He lures her in, and he genuinely falls for it. It's not one of those ones where he falls for it and then he goes, well, actually, I knew all along, and here's the second reveal, which happens quite a lot in this series. You think he's been outwitted, but he knew all along. In this one, he genuinely gets outwitted. And I thought that was a nice little thing to end on in the series.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Dress to Kill is a good film, but it's nothing you've not seen before.
It's through the motions, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. They've now got beyond the point where they're sort of riffing on Conan Doyle and they're riffing on the contemporary situation. They're now copying themselves. They're in film 14 or film 12 at Universal, and they're now repeating themselves. And Roy William Neill is borrowing from Roy William Neill. It's.
So we get the series ending here. So Rathbone decides to leave.
Yeah.
Apparently, Universal, they still had another 3 years left on the contract that they'd done with Universal,
and Bruce is still desperate to do them. And
Bruce, well, why not? Yeah. So they considered replacing him with Tom Conway, Falcon in the other series, who was also had a year on the radio show replacing Basil Rathbone. So there was potential crossover there. We could have had 3 to 6 more Tom Conway Sherlock Holmes in this series.
I'd have liked that. I can see Conway, especially with a sort of reduced budget. He was used to working in B-movie units. He'd worked in some of the Val Lewton stuff, and he's in the Falcon films, of course.
Taking over on that series as well from George Sanders. So.
Yeah. He'd have been a very good replacement Holmes, I think.
Yeah.
And again, Moriarty had already been replaced so many times across the franchise that I think audiences would have bought a new Holmes.
I think so too. Yeah, I think you think now 70+ actors have played Holmes on screen. Yeah. I think it's a trope that people would have no problem accepting a new Holmes now. So, but it's a shame we didn't get it. But that's the series. Yeah.
And then Rathbone, having said he wasn't going to come back to the role ever, did do. He did in TV a few times in the 1950s, but in pieces that are largely forgotten now, or probably don't even exist. I don't know, but as we say, what a legacy this series had. Because you're right, Adam. Everybody has used this as a template since. They go back to this series rather than going back to Conan Doyle. Even if they say they're going back to Conan Doyle, as the Jeremy Brett series did, there's an awful lot of Basil Rathbone in there.
Absolutely, and Nigel Bruce as well.
So.
Let's rehabilitate.
They say there isn't, and fans of that show say, "Oh, Edward Hardwicke plays Watson as far more of an equal and far more intelligent." I can see he's watched his Nigel Bruce.
Well, but even so, just the very fact that Watson is it's Holmes and Watson.
Yeah.
It is down to Nigel Bruce, because prior to that it was Sherlock Holmes.
Indeed,
and after that it was Holmes and Watson. So cool, there we go. Okay, we are all wrapped up. The case is solved, and no doubt Lestrade is taking all the credit. Thank you for joining me this week, Daryl, and thank you for listening. We will be back again soon with another episode. In the meantime, check out our Facebook page, and if you so desire, why not sign up to our Patreon, where you'll receive a bonus episode and early access to the regular releases. And finally, we are looking for topics for us to dive into. So please, if you have anything that you think Adam and Daryl and others should be looking at and taking a deep dive into, please send us an email at podcast@derbyquad.co.uk or get in contact at our Facebook page, and we'll see what we can do. Take care for now, and we will see you soon.